Our sandwich bread comes in a plastic bag, but I really wish it didn't. This demo, I think, is going to lead to a little bit of controversy, which I welcome in the comment section. I want to talk about bagged loaves versus whole loaves. And I'll start by saying we sell these. We also sell these. This is a frozen loaf, just so happens, but we sell it in its non-frozen state as well. And some of you will hate this idea that we sell these plastic bag loaves covering a beautiful artisan product. Let's take that fact aside and go to personal preferences of mine. You don't usually see this bread in my house. You'll always see the whole bread in my house. And different parts of the world have different bread traditions. So if proof existed in a certain place on earth outside the Arizona in the US, we might omit this stuff from our menu entirely. The standard form factor for a loaf of bread in our entire marketplace is this. In other words, if you go to the supermarket where most people find their bread, you'll find an entire aisle of just various versions of bread that looks like this. None of it is actually like this one, the one that we made. However, it all looks like this, at least in form. This form factor is probably, arguably, the most approachable form factor. This form factor is more of a traditional loaf of bread, meaning you can go back hundreds of years and the loaves of bread would look more similar to this. We got here through the Industrial Revolution, through mechanized bread production, through industrial slicers, namely the idea of convenience, the fact that you can take a slice here, pop it in a toaster, toast it up, and have it. The typical bread produced at an industrial scale has over 15 ingredients. They're 4 or 5 syllable words that are all the various preservatives and additives, dough enhancers. This particular loaf of bread, the ingredient label: flour, water, sourdough starter, butter, brown sugar, milk, and salt. All of those little extras above flour, water, and salt have the effect of creating a soft sandwich loaf. The sugar is not for sweetness, it is for moisture retention. This loaf keeps on the counter for about 8 days before the microbes get to it. That's the way I like it, because I don't really want to eat something that the entire biome doesn't want to touch, meaning if bacteria doesn't want to eat the food that you're eating, should you be eating the food that you're eating? I don't know. There's an argument for this type of bread, and the argument is that this is approachable, meaning let's say that my goal is to get more people to buy this loaf. If I omit this altogether from my menu, and now I'm left with this, I have a market for it, but I have a market that's already been educated, that has already experienced this kind of bread, that understands how to handle it. And the rest of the market, in this case in the US, the majority of the market just simply goes to the bakery that only serves bread in plastic. If I incorporate this loaf and this loaf, I now have a pathway of having conversations with my customers to getting them here. This loaf, fresh, meaning not frozen, has historically been our best-selling bread. It is the form factor of our country sourdough, but it's pre-sliced. And so it hits on 2 sort of desires. One is people are not comfortable slicing through their own bread, but it's a lot harder to slice bread with the straight serrated knife. I'm gonna take this fresh bread and then slice it with this knife. And mind you, I have a lot of practice slicing bread. But even for me, this knife provides some challenge. I still don't have an even slice, and now I'm gonna try to make 2 sandwich slices for myself. All right, so it certainly can be done. I got two fairly even slices with the straight edge serrated knife. But even for me, that was a bit of a challenge, and I can't count how many slices of bread I've sliced in the last 6 years. Certainly more than just the average person walking through the doors of my bakery. Add the slight bend of the knife, and the entire action of slicing becomes significantly easier. And this isn't even a fancy knife. We have nicer ones that are longer and make the process even easier. But no question that this even slicing happened faster than with the straight serrated edge. And so the knife matters. The quality of the knife matters. It is worthwhile to get yourself a nice bread knife. And to me, the angle seems to be the trick. Old habits die hard. So if I would like somebody to try whole bread, I can meet them halfway and pre-slice some bread for them, and then have conversations like this one about what you can do with a whole loaf or how you can make your life easier. A customer of ours can take this loaf and stick it in their freezer, and they can now enjoy this preservative-free loaf for a month with no problem. Maybe that is their actual bread consumption at home, meaning they're not eating that much bread at home. Another objection people have with even just the artisan form factor, the traditional form factor, is the lack of consistency in all the slices, meaning I'm buying this loaf of bread, and my perception of bread is sandwiches only. And now, what am I supposed to do with this piece? It's a tiny piece. I mean, what am I supposed to do with this piece? Compared to this one, it's not the same quality as sandwich. And the marketplace has been sort of drilled in for uniformity, consistency. I'd like to highlight a book. It's by Chef Massimo Bottura. It's called Bread is Gold. It's a really interesting take on all the various uses of old bread, mind you, new ones. There's a lot you can do with this end. For instance, let's say you prepare a simple soup at home on a rainy, cold day. This piece, this end piece, is a really nice complement to that soup and just as enjoyable as this more sandwich favorable piece. If you have that in your repertoire, or if you wish to gain that in your repertoire, now all of a sudden that loaf of bread has more uses than just sandwiches. But let's say it's even staled beyond the level that you're comfortable dipping it in soup. I can take this piece, slice it into such crumbs, such small chunks. Now I can toss these in olive oil, maybe season them with a little bit of salt, throw them in the oven low and slow, say 350, 375 degrees, let them crisp up, and add them to any salad as freshly made croutons. Another good use of old bread. I can take this same application actually, hydrate it in various forms of sweetened dairy, and turn this into bread pudding. I can take these and even stale versions of them, dip them in an egg batter, and turn them into French toast. Part of getting from here to here is teaching the versatility of the loaf of bread. Because oftentimes, after years and years and years of going down the supermarket aisle and seeing this, and also, frankly, seeing the texture of this heavily enriched, artificially preserved bread, it's not quite as good for some of those other applications or quite as enjoyable. Nor do you have the need, because the bread doesn't stale easily. It stays fresh in this fresh and dead in this container of plastic for a really long period of time. And so, a month later, people are still making a sandwich on that bread. Well, that's not going to happen even with this loaf. week into it, you have to choose to freeze or start to use that bread for some other purpose. It's best to take it out of its plastic after day 5 if you're not going to freeze it. Because if you keep it in this trapped environment where moisture can collect, that is what invites mold. Whereas this whole loaf of bread that's sitting out and getting drier by the day, it does not invite mold very easily. In fact, I have yet to see it happen in any reasonable amount of time. The bread stales and hardens more and more over time, but it doesn't mold. And so you have a long shelf life if you know how to handle the bread, and if you start using different techniques to enjoy your bread other than just the straight sandwich. At our bakery, what we end up doing is taking any unsold bread from today, slicing it, and throwing it in the freezer, where we actually sell it at a discount. So that discounted bread invites a conversation. We actually make it somewhat inconvenient for people to get this bread from us in particular. When we sell it fresh, meaning not the frozen version, we actually upcharge for it, for the cost of the slicing, the cost of the bag, the cost of the extra processing, and the fact that this is not our bread and butter, so to say. This is. We also make people walk out of our bakery, go next door to our grocery store, have a completely separate transaction to even have this bread. The bread here in our bakery is all just the whole uncut versions. We also are reducing waste. So instead of this bread going out to the dumpster when we don't sell it, we're preserving it for another month in the freezer where it's just as good for our customers. So there's a lot to this conversation. I agree with those of you who believe that there's better solutions than this petroleum-based plastic bag. We have been working with these are produce bags. They're not quite freezer bread bags, but actually, interestingly, when I go and buy these bags, they are labeled as produce bags too. So pretty similar thickness, size, everything. Next door at Main Street Harvest, we purchased these compostable bags. But the problem that I've had with them, oh, here we go. So in just the normal operation of ripping the bag from its perforated edge, 1 out of 3 rips the actual bag itself and doesn't have a clean break. And this has been a problem with this particular product. Now, they are compostable, but they are only compostable in a commercial composting facility, meaning I can't take this to my existing compost pile at my house, which I have, toss it in and expect it to compost like normal. It even says commercially compostable only. Facilities may not exist in your area. I agree that this is a better alternative to this, although not if this ends up in the landfill anyway, and not if it's so cost prohibitive and has a worse quality that it creates more frustration than it's worth. Even just filling them, they're more brittle. I can poke a hole more easily than in the other bag. So putting potatoes in this bag or some other produce simply did not hold up to the task. So my question is, have I just not found the right resources? Am I looking at this incorrectly? Or do we need to have a different conversation altogether? And that's, some of you ought to leave your computer screens and start commercial composting facilities and bring that to market. I will participate. I'm with you. I don't want to use the petroleum-based plastic bag any more than the next person who's watching this video. However, my consumer marketplace demands this. I would say 99.9% of all bread sold in the United States comes in a plastic bag. So that's where my audience is right now. I can choose to alienate them, or I can choose to bring them into my fold and have conversations reducing the plastic. Now, if you insist on a pre-sliced bread, meaning if you come up to my counter and say, do you have a slicer? Can you pre-slice it for me and bag it for me? I'll say, I don't have a slicer here, and you'll have to walk all the way out the door, next door, pay an extra $1, and take your pre-sliced loaf home. If I happen not to sell my whole loaves, which they're my top selling bread here, then I will cut them up for you and freeze them in order to prevent them going to the dumpster. This is the way that I've resolved this particular conflict. It's not an easy discussion. I think the entire marketplace needs to shift some, and that's going to happen through a lot of conversations. It doesn't happen through just pure alienation and abandonment of the mainstream process. We've got to meet people where they're at. We've got to have conversations starting from that point of meeting people somewhere in the middle. A preservative-free, approachable loaf of bread that's good for sandwiches and meets the form factor requirements. From there, I can get people to maybe try the artisan form of that bread, the flour, water, salt form. From there, I can maybe on their third or fourth interaction, sample a whole loaf, talk about the refreshing method, maybe point them to this particular video, and get them to try a whole loaf at home. Maybe they'll take home a bread knife and make that whole experience themselves easier. So over time, I can move the needle, and we have. A few years ago, that pre-sliced, pre-bagged loaves outsold our whole loaves 2-to-1. Today, our whole loaves outsell our pre-sliced loaves, although slightly, and it's very competitive. So that is just where it's at demand-wise. Albeit, we make all these efforts to steer people in a different direction. It's an interesting conversation. I'm really looking forward to engaging in the comments here and seeing what everybody else has to say on this.